David has served as the RFA Director of Policy Research since 2016, where he oversees a range of projects in the nexus of education, research, and policy. Before joining RFA, David was a staff attorney for 7 years at the Education Law Center in Pennsylvania, where he litigated cases on behalf of students and families. And also he conducted policy research on a wide variety of legal issues related to public education. Saxon serves as RFA Director of Community Engagement, where he provides leadership, strategic planning, and visioning for RFA to expand community engagement with education research. And before joining RFA, Saxon was a contractor for special projects for the Pennsylvania Department of Education. He actually worked with our Donna Marie and in the Office of Post-Secondary and Higher Education. And he focused on special projects and efforts being made by the department on equity and access. And he actually was one of the first people to work with the Aspiring to Educate project. And also our Sharif is a former principal and teacher and the founder of the Fellowship Black Male Educators for Social Justice and a founding member of the Mayor's Commission on African American Males. And he's the former U.S. Department of Education's Principal Ambassador Fellow and a U.S. delegate to the International Summit on Teaching, Learning, and a conference on integrating refugees and immigrants into the schools. So I would like for you all to welcome Saxon, Sharif, and David as they talk to us about data in Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone. Maybe good afternoon for some folks, or bright and early morning for maybe some folks on the West Coast who might be with us. I was going to do introductions, but Karen did an amazing job. So Sharif and David, so glad to see you guys are here with us. I'm going to get started by sharing my screen and getting our PowerPoint up and ready. So we are here this morning to talk about taking stock, a data-infused conversation about recent efforts to increase educator diversity in Pennsylvania. And we have a lot of information to share with folks. I'm inspired by that last session with Sharif ending on time. So we will plan on making sure we stick to the time frame. So as we begin our conversation, let's quickly remember the extensive evidence of the positive impact of teachers of color. Teachers of color promote higher expectations for students of color, contribute to the positive academic and non-academic outcomes, minimize exclusionary discipline for students of color, increase likelihood of enrollment in a four-year college for all students, mitigate implicit bias in all students, improve school climate for all students, and reduce teacher turnover in hard to staff schools. This is just some of the positive impacts. As we know, there are so many that have been researched, documented, and now, we want to start here so we all can just be grounded in what we know is work that needs to happen across the state. And as we move forward, let's take some time to speak to this issue in its context, recent context in Pennsylvania. I'll now turn it over to Sharif.
This context and Malcolm X quote is one of the things that continues to inspire me as a former literature and social studies teacher at Turner Middle School, where I started my career. History is one of those disciplines that supports our work no matter where we are. If we study and understand the history, then that helps us. So one of the things that we've really looked at was the impact of history. And while we talk about teacher diversity now, we know that there's a long legacy of particularly Black educators and educators of color in this country and throughout. The concept of public education, particularly in the South, was really conceived by Black people who were recently emancipated and determined to get education. Even before that, they risked life and limb to be able to read and pass that along for generations. At the Center for Black Educator Development, one of the things that we did was we just wanted to share, because it's not a new phenomenon, but people sometimes think that when people are talking about things today, that means it just started yesterday, when no, this happened a long time ago and all the way back to the continent. And so we started a Black Educator Stories and Black Educators Hall of Fame that we started linking in partnership with Philly 7th Ward and the center to elevate that. We know that thousands of schools were developed in the South and elsewhere. We know that the Brown versus Board of Education decision decimated the Black teacher pipeline. And when we talk about today at the Center for Black Educator Development of building the Black teacher pipeline, we really mean rebuilding it, because there was once a very strong, cohesive pipeline that was used to elevate Black educators so that they can continue to support the next generation. But 38,000 Black teacher administrators were fired, demoted, laid off, because many schools that were founded on racist principles said, we'll take your children, the Black children, because there's money attached to them. My friend Chris Stewart calls Black children the new cotton. And so they saw that as a funding opportunity to tax Black citizens, to accept some of their Black children, even if it meant that relegating them to the academic basement. But they were not going to take Black teachers in mass. And so they were systematically fired and laid off. We know that Black teachers and educators of color are often in the hardest working conditions. And if we know that it's an oppressive learning environment, it's also an oppressive teaching environment for Black children and Black students. And there's also the history of how folks like me came into the field. There was a partnership between an organization, a national nonprofit, Concerned Black Men, the School District of Philadelphia, and Cheyney University, where I eventually got my master's degree and principal cert, because I was on my way to law school, but I met Dr. Martin Ryder and others, who was a veteran educator in the School District of Philadelphia, and convinced me that the purest form of activism was teaching Black children well. And so I delayed law school, and now for the 28th year, and joined the teaching workforce at Turner Middle School in Southwest Philadelphia. And that's where I met folks like Salome Thomas L. and Hildebrand Pelzer III and Leonard Hurd, Black administrators who supported, mentored, and coached many of myself and other colleagues like Chris Johnson, Principal S.L.A. Bieber, and others. And they formed the Association of Black School Administrators, ABSA. And later on in 2014, we founded the Fellowship Black Male Educators for Social Justice, which led to hosting national Black male educator convenings, which was open to all, but centering the voices and experiences of current and aspiring Black male educators. And we know that we trace our roots to the African Institute, which is what Cheyney University was formerly known as. Independent Black schools that I put in the chat before, led by folks like Mama Renee Fluellen, Mama Fasaha Trailer, Baba Changa, Baba Mjenzi, and so forth, in the Germantown section of Philadelphia. And many of my classmates and schoolmates are teachers, educators, professors, serving their communities. And Caroline LeCount, and I'll end with this. This is not a new thing. In the 1800s, Caroline LeCount right here in Philadelphia was demanding more Black educators in the 1800s. And so we're still having these conversations. And the 1967 Black student walkout, where the police commissioner sicked his henchmen on Black high school students, one of their demands was more Black teachers. So that's the context. It is nothing new, as the roots say, nothing new, nothing new. They ain't saying nothing new. And neither are we, but we are now in this context coalescing around this issue to push hard once again.
So just to provide a little more context, so it's so good to be with you all. name's David Lapp, and I'll just wanted, I'm from Research for Action. I just wanted to sort of point out that that the way that RFA got brought into this work was really from following the work of Sharif and many other educators of color who were calling out the alarm for what was happening in and not happening in our schools. And so we were able to get our hands on some data that's available to try and document that and to add some research support to that. So what we see over the last 2 decades, and here we're looking specifically at Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia over the last 2 decades, there has been a major decline in the number and the percentage of Black teachers in particular in district schools. So this is just School District Philadelphia, and one should, of course, understand that Philadelphia is a little complicated to look at because over these same 2 decades, the percentage of students in charter schools has gone from 2 or 3% to over 33%. So this is just looking right now at the School District of Philadelphia. And if you advance, so here we see that the percentage of Black teachers has gone down while the percentage of white teachers has gone up. Other teachers of color, Asian teachers, Hispanic teachers have increased slightly, but not nearly to the extent that would make up for the decline in other teachers of color. And this is not just a Philadelphia thing. At the statewide, we also see that the gap between the percentage of students of color and teachers of color is growing. Very, very modest. In the last couple of years, we've seen a very slight increase in our overall teachers of color, but that has not kept pace with the more rapid rise of students of color. So one other quick thing to just mention on this, I know that there are people who've been attending this have seen data from a number of places, and you'll notice there's slight differences in the margins here in some of these percentages. And that really is just a result of using some different data sources, but also using different methodologies and how the data is cleaned. The way that RFA was doing this work is that we were using data from the Pennsylvania Department of Education and that listed individual teachers and then compiling and calculating that ourselves. What we did is we calculated it at the FTE level, meaning full-time equivalent. So 2 half-time teachers would equal 1 teacher in that. And that might result in some minor discrepancies in what you saw from some of the EdTrust data yesterday and perhaps some others. So just, this is some additional context. So it's easy to see why Sharif and many other educators of color were sounding the alarm bells in the early 2000s and beyond. I'll turn this back to Sharif.
Yeah, and thank you, David, for that context. And you can see that those graphs were really, alarming, and we appreciate, RFA for helping to really ring the alarm with us and being able to dive deep into the data. So I would say, in 2015, we started this. The first convening for the fellowship, Black Male Educators for Social Justice. And that was really grounded in some of the work that I was doing at the U.S. Department of Ed as a Principal Ambassador Fellow, where I had the opportunity to share the principal's perspective with U.S. Secretary of Education and his cabinet, both Arne Duncan and then later John King. And so being able to do that, we all had a capstone project that we had to do. I chose teacher diversity because I knew that I came in through the Concerned Black Men, but that program had ended abruptly. And I did not see where this pipeline was, but initially I thought it was just Philadelphia, but being able to work in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years, I saw that this was a national issue. And so there were young Black men who were reaching out and considering leaving the profession. And at that time, I was aware of it's only 2% of us who are teachers across the country who identify as Black men. And I would say, let's get together, let's connect, let's meet. And while a lot of people look at me as like, oh, you started this, it wasn't something that I started, it was something that I learned, because when I was a new teacher and a principal, as I mentioned, ABSA and other folks, Concerned Black Men, Yvonne Savior, who was Pennsylvania, one of the few Black women who was Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year, was my my coach, my mentor, as well as Chris Johnson and many others. And so we were continuing this tradition of lifting as we climb, as Mary Church Terrell used to talk about. This led to the first National Black Male Educator convening in 2017. And then in 2018, we just started seeing that there was more attention. A lot of it is, as David shared, through RFA's resources, and able to, one, things that we did not have the capacity to do, which was one example of not only sifting through the data, but filing for a right to know. Petitions to have access to the data. And that really, I think it's a shame that that has to happen for this type of what should be public information, which should lead to goal setting, benchmarking, feedback loops, all of the things that just make promising practices. It seems like it should be a norm for an institution that is there to show leadership for education and educators and what they would want teachers to do in a classroom, but we're not doing it at the systems level. And so all of these, I think, coalesce and continue to come together in a way, and we're excited that this PEDC is now in existence to continue charging forward and growing the coalitions that are necessary across the state to address this educational and racial justice issue. And so in 2019, so all the things before, I was a sitting principal. And at some point, someone said, like, hey, if the things that keep coming to the front of your mind, maybe you should be spending more time paying attention to it. So I retired from the principalship to launch the Center for Black Educator Development with a group of just outstanding colleagues who are all in as educators and administrators. And we are grateful. This is our 4th year running Freedom Schools Literacy Academy. This summer, we have over 100 teacher apprentices who are working and practicing teaching, learning the mindset, skill, and will necessary to be a part of this. And as we mentioned before, when PDE created this Aspiring to Educate pilot focused here in Southeast Pennsylvania, we were excited to be part of this collaborative effort to continue that work through the A2E consortium that Dr. Juliet Kirchie applied for funding from A2E. We started working with under Saxon Nelson's leadership, and we're excited to continue this effort. And so that happened in 2019, and here we are in 2020.
Yeah, and Sharif, I'll jump in a little here, just to provide some context to the Aspiring to Educate point. So I've been able to attend the summit a little bit here and there yesterday and earlier today. So I know that the Aspiring to Educate program has been mentioned, but I wanted to take some time just to unpack how Aspiring to Educate was created and what the program actually is. PDE was committed to ensuring that its policies were inclusive and representative of the needs and experiences of students, educators, and communities across the Commonwealth. The development of this program was grounded in the experience and perspectives of Pennsylvania stakeholders. Myself at the time and Dr. Jacobson traveled the state conducting a series of roundtable discussions with educators from school systems, the Out of School Time Network, students, as well as community champions. We also conducted a Schools That Teach tour with multiple institutions of higher education, where visits were designed to engage stakeholders across Pennsylvania in rich conversations about the barriers and opportunities for improving racial diversity of the Commonwealth's educator workforce. A total of 14 discussions were facilitated throughout Pennsylvania. More than 120 stakeholders were engaged. The entire process was research informed to be certain that we were creating a sustainable framework the A2E program was built from. After gathering stakeholder input around the Commonwealth, analyzing and synthesizing the data, and consulting with national education organizations, PDE decided to partner with local institutions of higher education to launch the Aspiring to Educate program, A shout out to Dr. Donna Marie Cole-Malott, who I know is playing an integral role in this summit, who joined PDE around this time to support our efforts in the creation of cultural competencies that I know have been presented during this summit yesterday. Donna Marie and I, kind of to Sharif's point, met Juliet kind of in the early days of the A2E work, which was the IHE Consortium, which is now PEDC. I want to pull up one resource as I continue. The A2E program still is on the PDE website if anyone is interested. This, there was, as Sharif mentioned, an A2E pilot program to start in January 2020, announced by Philadelphia by Secretary Rivera at that time, with the School District of Philadelphia, the Center for Black Educator Development, the Philadelphia Youth Network, the Community College of Philadelphia, Cheney, Westchester, Temple, Drexel, Arcadia, and Cabrini universities. PDE at the time had committed $490,000 to this pilot. Also at the time of the launch, all the A2E institutional partners were willing to offer reduced and free tuition opportunities for students a part of this pipeline. All of these efforts and the design of the A2E program made A2E the first of its kind in the country when it comes to efforts to diversify the educator workforce. PDE also had plans to launch the program in other high-need communities. As I continue, I want to show folks kind of the program structure very briefly. The pilot was focused on the implementation of the youth pathway for aspiring educators. This tier of the program begins with juniors in high school with a path into a partnering institute. And the higher education is prepared them to really kind of support the needs that they had. This final tier that you'll see here, the adult pathway and the post-baccalaureate pathways, were two other avenues for folks in this program. When faced with historic challenges, as I bring our PowerPoint back up here, when faced with historic challenges, like diversifying the educator workforce that has plagued the Commonwealth for decades, solutions must be built by looking for those who have been championing this effort. So I have to tip my hat in this setting to folks like Judge Smith-Wibner, Esther Bush, the president and CEO of the Urban League, Dr. Generals and Dr. Thomas at CCP, Sharif, who really inspired me to build something at PDE that would really answer the call for this issue in Pennsylvania and possibly the rest of the country. I'm thankful to have met so many people along the path that were committed to solving this issue. And I think now we know what it will take to do so. I'm gonna warp speed here in our presentation to catch up and turning it back over. And just wanted to speak a little bit about where we are today, right? So you see kind of the launch of Aspiring to Educate. The COVID-19 pandemic made everything more complicated, right? We also have now the PEDC Consortium, which has been mentioned multiple times around drafting policy recommendations and toolkits. And what we have now, where we are with this recent, looking at this review of recent issues connected to educator diversity, we have a growing network of dedicated individuals and organizations. I think that's been spoken about a lot during this summit. Increased awareness among school leaders and stakeholders across the state. Additional educator diversity efforts from other parts of the state. We've seen Pittsburgh with their Para to Teacher program and other efforts in Allegheny County. And what we don't have, still no regular reporting, as David mentioned, on public data on teacher diversity. We still have big leaks in the teacher pipeline, and there doesn't seem to be any dedicated funding from any level to support those leaks. David, as you continue to break down some of this recent data to support this discussion.
So I'll just close it out with a little bit more of that context, taking stock on sort of where we are. So we published this graphic of our teacher pipeline a couple of years ago. We updated it just a couple of weeks ago for this thing and for this event. And we see we're leaking all the way through this. And I just want to shout out here that this is a failure of policy, right? This is a failure of policymakers, that these are gaps in opportunity that we're failing to close, right? There's a tendency amongst people without proper context to blame teachers, to blame people. to blame aspiring educators, when really this is a sign of a failure of policy that we need to fix. One other thing I'll note is that, so we go from, over 33% of our students being students of color, but only 6% of our teachers being teachers of color. And we see some places along where we're dropping out potential teachers of color throughout the way. We also see that there's parts of this aspect that we don't know, that we don't have data yet to answer some of these questions around where some of the loss is happening. But we're seeing a lot of leaks that of course need to be plugged. You advance the slide here, Saxon. The other thing I'll just say about data availability, it's true. We don't have public reporting. We have done some data requests, but this is not the same, right? This is a nonprofit publishing publications. This is not the state, the government itself making this data measurement an annual part of what it does, right? We collect all kinds of data around student demographics. We know every school, every school district, all county, the whole state, we know the data on student diversity. We break it down by test scores, we break it down by graduation rates, we break it down by all kinds of other aspects. We don't do that yet for our educators, and we know how important it is. But through this data request, we are able to at least get some window here. We see there's gaps here of across all subgroups of racial, ethnic subgroups, except for white teachers and students, where white students see their race being overrepresented in the teaching force. And one other thing, I'll come back to this, but this is not, yes, this is a national problem, but it is not normal. This is a bigger problem in Pennsylvania, and we'll see that through some future slides. So advance to the next one real quickly, go through this. 184 school districts only have white teachers. And this map, where it's red, means there are no teachers of color. And even in places where there's higher rates of teachers of color across the state, they're still underrepresented. In Philadelphia, where we see the highest concentration, they're still significantly underrepresented. So this map shows sort of the scope of the problem that's there to be solved. In the next slide, we see that there's 1,000 schools, more than 1,000 schools, that haven't had a teacher of color in any of the last 7 years. So we've requested 7 years of data from the Department of Ed, and these schools have never had a teacher of color, only white teachers for students in those schools. And we know the negative impact, the gaps in education that's leaving for all students, that not just for students of color, but for all students. So advance the slide to the next one. Also, just to point out, there's also a gender gap that's happening here, but the gap by race is happening, the gap by gender is happening across each racial subgroup. So there's more white women than white men, there's more white Black women than Black men, teachers, and for each racial subgroup, we see that. And this is actually increasing. The percentage of women in the teaching workforce is greater in most recent years than it has been in the past. Advance the slide. And just, I think this is the last slide, and I'll just underscore this again. This is not normal. If there are more, Pennsylvania is a slightly less diverse than the national average overall, but our teacher workforce is significantly more homogenous than it is across the nation. And if you look at what that is, sort of as a ratio, if you advance the slide, Saxon, 2 more, I think it shows, there's 2.5 proportionally more white teachers, or I'm sorry, students of color than there are teachers of color across the nation. But in Pennsylvania, it's 5.9 times more students of color than the teacher of color proportionally. So this is a bigger problem in Pennsylvania. When we did back in the Leaky pipeline, the national data is a number of years later than this, but when we looked at this, ranked it, Pennsylvania was among the worst of all the states with that gap between the share of students and teachers of color. So I will stop there. That context.
Yep, that concludes. We are about 1 minute over time, but we're close enough. So I think, Karen, I'm turning back to you, I